Just
But
there was one thing I forgot to
okay.
mention that's important in the 1890s, while the in the white community they were
Your camera, your camera is off. Your camera is off.
uh,
Yeah,
in
there
the
you
1890s, while in the white community they were discussing and planning South Africa's future, there was a similar debate amongst Africans, and the Africans were campaigning for equal access to education, and their vision of a future society was one where individual success was based on individual merit. So if you got a good education and a good job, well, then equal opportunity. They weren't asking for any favor, and they not just campaigned; they opened schools, and hundreds of Africans went to the U.S. and to England for university. So, I mean, for one of many examples, Reverend Dube, the first president of the ANC, got his university degree in the U.S. And when he came home, he set up Oshlanga Institute, which was based on a model of American education at one of the Black universities at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. So it's there were two very, very different visions of the future. One obviously had the power and was able to implement, but it didn't stop Africans from doing what they could do to acquire better education. And that was a consistent struggle, and hundreds left the country and returned with education, became involved in many different kinds of activities. So, and it was only until after 94 was South Africa able to switch the strategy towards equal education. But as we were saying with Vista, changing an institution like Vista was obviously a challenge, which proved, in fact, to be too difficult a challenge, and the university was closed. It was because the university's faculty senates have a lot of power, and the faculty senate was dominated by Broederbond. They did everything they could to block any possible change.
Wow.
And eventually even getting Cato fired. So it was it was a struggle, but we were successful in what we did. And our program was based on the integration of theory and practice, the opposite of fundamental pedagogy.
The opposite of what they sought to do.
So that was it was a conscious decision to set up a program to integrate theory and practice and create opportunities for experiential learning. That was the whole thing. But I didn't have the business background. I needed somebody who knew something about business, and that's how you came in. So you were then responsible for creating this program. But one of the challenges was the professors at Vista, who could tell you what a business plan included, but never wrote one, were basically useless in an experiential learning program. So that's why we had to make a deal with Business Skills South Africa. So you were trained, and then you were able to manage a program to train a lot of people. There were a lot of people went through that program, and there were other programs. We had one dealing for law students and others, and
community justice.
Yes.
Community justice program. You know what was funny about the small business development program was that, yes, I had a sales and marketing background academically, but I didn't have any experience. So I had to be trained at the same time as I was supervising the students. And it was crazy, especially when you see the kind of success that we managed to achieve. But I wanted to mention the law program, the community justice program. it's amazing how many students who graduated from the programs that you conceptualized and implemented went on to become. I mean, when you got me involved with the projects and you were comfortable going to Stanza Bobape, and it's amazing being a white person coming from America, and you were walking around Stanza Bobape, going and having meetings in derelict buildings. That was also challenging for me. With a rural background from Limpopo, and then having to go to such an informal settlement, it was quite intimidating. But what I wanted to mention quickly, David, was that there are so many students who are part of the program. Actually, I have a list somewhere, and I'm trying to trace it. I've been very good at preserving the documents that we had then. And most of them, it's like the success rate was about 90% for the small business development program. Some of those learners have become entrepreneurs. They've become, some of them, business support practitioners, and some got very lucrative employment with private sector companies and public sector agencies. But Ruben, I wanted to tell you about Ruben Mhlala, because I tried to send you pictures, and yeah, and some photos that I took, because Ruben is now with the Competitions Commission, and he's a top guy there, one of the top guys. I saw him on a program. He's using his native name. I just forgot his native name, and he was being interviewed, and it was during this financial sector scandal where the banks manipulated the rent and so forth. And Ruben was at the center of that issue at the side of the Competitions Commission. So, I mean, it's mind-blowing to see what the program was able to do.
That's what I found interesting about that story, was that in the English tradition, you graduate law school, you go to law school after high school, graduate, and then you usually have to do articles, and then you can get a job. So the Competition Commission had never hired anyone with just a degree. He was the first person that they had ever hired who had not gone through the articles. So
you mean whom? So you were aware of Ruben's employment at the Competitions Commission?
Oh, yes, yeah. So, and he was the first person that they hired straight out of law school, because they gave him credit for all of the experiential learning.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing.
So
yeah,
it's for me, there's a very simple principle, and that was to have respect for young people's willingness to work and capacity to make mistakes and learn from them. One of my favorite stories in the small business program was a project which totally failed, and I knew it was going to fail. And it was some students that they were, if you remember, part of, I'm sure you remember, but for the listeners, the way the project worked was a student would find some small business owner that was struggling and do an analysis and a strategy to help them to improve. Whatever the analysis said. So one of the students, or a couple of students, found this guy who was a very successful candle maker. And he had a business selling candles, and he was doing very well at selling candles. But the problem was he was selling them at a cost below the competitors. Why he had sales, but he was also selling it below the cost of his raw materials. It's just making them by hand. So he started off with capital, and after a while, his business was going great, but he ran out of money because he wasn't making a profit. So the students said, "Oh, no, we have to help this guy, and we need to give him some money to buy the raw materials." I said, "Okay." So we did, and gave him the money, and he kept carrying on, and the money ran out. Just as predicted. But the students, they couldn't grasp that at the beginning, but by the end of the experience, they they understood more about spreadsheets and profit and loss and cost.
Cost estimation.
Yeah.
I remember not the guy in particular. I can't remember I can't put a face to the story that you're talking about, the candle making business. But I remember because we did a site visit. I went with the students to the guy. Yeah, I remember that one.
So
and it's a typical small business problem. Yeah.
But it was really it was not only a good program, but for me, I learned a lot. When I first came to South Africa in the U.S., I was PhD, had lectured at university. I was an expert on South Africa. I was in South Africa for 2 weeks, and I began to realize how ignorant I was. Talking to somebody, and they mentioned social Nguvi, and I said, "What's that?" So, during all my years in South Africa, I've continually discovered things that I didn't know that I didn't know, and learn. So it's that small business project. We met all kinds of small business people and saw all kinds of problems and issues, and wonderful, hardworking people that needed some help.
Yeah.
And it was a great experience for all of us.
And it was very interesting when you were talking about rote learning, fundamental pedagogy. I remember in particular during the training of the students, one student was helping this business and they had to prepare a business plan for the business. And mostly, as you remember, they were working with some of the traders who were selling at the main gate of Vista University. And one student actually said, I can't prepare the balance sheet for this small business because they don't have land and buildings. And that was an example of land and buildings. Land and buildings. Because according to the apartheid rote learning methodology, fundamental pedagogy, every business has to have land and buildings because it was memorization. And that's what the apartheid curriculum did. So it's I will say I always admire your patience. One of the things I suppose that made you very successful with mentorship of young people and working with young people was your patience. Because like you said, I remember how many papers Ruben or concept Ruben wrote and brought to you, and then you would correct them until Ruben mastered writing. It was the same with me. I think it was tragic, or it was a shock for me because, coming from a rural school in Limpopo, I was like, I had an A grade in matric. I had an A grade in English. And guess what? There was a teacher was an activist there at my school, was an English teacher. He couldn't mark my script and he was angry. He confused me because I wrote this essay and he just wrote on my paper that, make sure that when we give you an assignment to do, you go and write it. Don't take it to somebody else to write it for you. And it was a subtle message, but he didn't mark anything. And I was just left confused. He didn't say it in so many words. He was a very subtle guy. And he just didn't mark my script. He brought it back. And I figured it out later that he didn't know what to say. And the other thing is that a distinction that I got in English, I was studying Julius Caesar, William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And I got an A grade in English. My English essay, was the best in Limpopo. And when I got to tertiary, I was a SASCO activist. We would issue circular. I used to write circulars. And when I started working with you, to my shock, every little thing I wrote and submitted to you for proofreading, it just came, with a red pen all over the page. And it went on and on until I wrote one letter that we're taking to Vista. And for the very first time, like in 2 years or 3 years or even 5 years, and you said I could just hang this letter on my on the wall of my lounge and just frame it and put it there. I just want to demonstrate to you how your mentoring, how helpful it was. And today, as I speak, we are talking about the book that I've wrote, and of course your influence, your passion for writing, conceptualizing rubbed onto me, and I had no choice but to learn how to write. So one other thing that I wanted to ask you about is you initiated the small business development program, and as far as I'm concerned, the success rate was amazing. At the time, there were no learnerships. I mean, it was I think is the earliest form of learnership, of a learnership program that I saw at the time, if you can follow me. So my question to you is, what do you think is the missing, is the weakness in the small business development strategy here in South Africa? Because look, the unemployment just got worse. Yeah. And the expectation is that those in the know will tell you that most jobs must come from the small business sector. What are we getting wrong according to your understanding and analysis?
Just as a lesson from the Vista project, it's the basic lesson was the need to incorporate experiential learning projects within the university curriculum. Every university student should be in. There should be a requirement. Every university student has to be involved in some sort of experiential learning. So, and it's true today as it was then that there's a need to improve service delivery, which is a big problem, obviously, and improve experiential learning. And it's what the other thing that the project proved was young people have a lot to offer. You don't have to have a PhD to be able to do a lot of things. And you don't have to be perfect. You just need to get involved with good support and mentorship. So we came up with an idea, which we did try to implement, of having service delivery centers in the community staffed with students with supervision. And from the government's point of view, you can dramatically increase the amount of service delivery cheap, because the students basically are not getting paid. They're actually paying for their education and not getting paid. They're getting the experiential learning as part of their education, and the community gets the services at low cost. And we actually did implement such a project with a partnership with City of Tshwane, if you remember. And we got a grant. And the problem was that we got the grant and then the money got stolen. So, when we come to, if we get to a discussion about the challenges of today and corruption, well, we had a project which offered solutions, and it was sabotaged by certain individuals, so we won't mention their names. But in terms of the challenge of enterprise development, there's a principle in business management, metrics or measurements. And you pick things to measure, and that helps you with your strategic planning in the business. So there's things that you have to measure if you want to correct mistakes and move forward. So, and the problem is that in business, the workers will then work to the metrics, because you want to, the things that you get your bonus for are the things that are measured. Now the problem is, if the metrics are wrong, it's a problem. So now in the small business field back then, and it may still be true, to be successful, small businesses need a variety of support interventions, finance, legal support, business skills training, the things that you've been involved with. So you need all of those things. So different organizations came into being with government grants some to provide finance, some to provide business training, some to do this and some to do the other thing. But there was no coordination. So the metric for each group was how many people did you, whatever, finance or service. So the metric, according to the metrics, the small business interventions were highly successful. Lots of people were getting training, funding, and all of that. The problem was one company got training and another company got the finance. So they all
David, you put your finger on the pulse. I couldn't agree more. In my previous interview, I was talking to a tax practitioner and accountant, and that's one thing I highlighted, that my 25 years of involvement in enterprise development and training, that's one thing I can single out. It's like the interventions and the resources that are spent there are meant to justify the existence of the institutions and the agencies that are providing support to small businesses, not to develop the small businesses. And exactly as you said, if there is 10 million allocated, it is more about quantity than the quality of the intervention, because the resources will be spread.
Even if the quality is excellent and you only get one intervention, it's wasted.
Yeah. It is wasted. So I couldn't agree more with you. Yeah.
But the proper metric is how many small businesses pass the 2-year survival. You make it past 2 years, then you've got a good chance of surviving. So if the key metric is 2 years survival, and of course South Africa scores very low on that, last I looked. So if you measure the 2-year survival rate, and then you back that up with a coordination of services, so anybody that gets into the system has to get multiple interventions. So the measurement is how many companies are getting all the support that they need, and what's the survival rate. Those are the metrics that count. So the solution is, in a sense, simple. Use the proper metrics, and organizations will follow suit. So it sounds simple, but it sounds, from what you're saying, unfortunately, the problem is still the same.
Absolutely. And, it's like I see the interventions or whatever we're trying to do is just back and forth, you can't see, there's no clear direction as to where and how the efforts to support small businesses must be directed. But I think you articulated the challenges in a very clear way. Now, I just want to turn to maybe to you have touched on politics, corruption, and experienced in the country just recently, and even now as we speak, and as we sit here, the result of the lack of service delivery is that the ANC has gone down to 40%, and today we are talking. It's the eve of the inauguration of the 7th administration. The parliament is sitting, electing the president, and so forth. So, in hindsight, having been involved with the anti-apartheid movement, what do you think is there anything that you regret, that you think could have been done differently to kind of preempt what we see now, the persistent challenges of socio-economic development?
Well, it's a tough question, but again, being the historian, I'm just going to ask you to go back to the early 90s for a minute to remember what things were like. And people like to talk about how South Africa, the miracle transition, peaceful transition to democracy. Well, it wasn't peaceful. During the period of the struggle, if you look at Southern Africa as a whole, there was like some 3 million people killed because of the South African government. In Namibia and Angola and Mozambique, Zimbabwe, all those people that died because of most of the battles were not inside South Africa; they were in all the neighboring. And in the early 90s, there was the whole wave of violence that occurred in that time period as well. That was encouraged by the government. They released Mandela and then unleashed a wave of violence against ANC. You know, if you were Mandela, you were safe, but all the lower level people were attacked, middle level people. And of course, there even some senior people lost their lives. But so it was not peaceful, and the ANC had difficult choices. So there was a whole set of compromises, including the first government of national unity, and there was the 5-year ban on changing people, and you couldn't fire any of the holdovers from the previous government and civil service. You look at budget cycles when the ANC comes in, but the budget was already passed. Budget cycles take several years, so it took several years before they could begin even having a budget of their own creation. The ANC had limited management capacity. This is and there was huge international pressures on the ANC. Go slow, don't upset the system. Don't change things too fast. And the threats, if you do, there'll be capital flight. The British government threatened to withhold recognition to the transition if the new government went after the British mining companies for the huge environmental damage that had been caused in the past. That was a behind-the-scenes subtle threat that I learned about. So, given all of those conditions of slow change, it created a lot of opportunities for opportunists to get into government. People that switch sides at the last minute. All of the young people that joined the MK that spent their years fighting, or the ones that boycotted school and gave up their education, the ones that didn't do that had the advantage. So it was tough, and it's just from perspective. As an older person, one of my advantages is that I can have a longer view, and I'll remember how tough it was. But young people also have a certain advantage because they're young and they're not trapped by all those things that I just said is 30, 40 years ago. So younger people aren't thinking about all of those things. They're thinking about state capture and poor service delivery. So it's younger people have a newer, fresher vision. They're not encumbered by their, by knowledge of the past. I mean, in this election, I saw that the ANC trotted out all of the older and often retired leaders. Thabo Mbeki was back on the campaign trail. Well, if you're a young person, who's Thabo Mbeki?
But I mean, that is symbolic. It's indicative of how low the bar has gone, because in a sense, they're telling you that they cannot, among the younger people that they have within the movement, there are no worthy people that they can use to pull the crowds. I mean, if you parade people who are in charge now, most of them, communities have got grievances against them. Those are the people who provoke the anger of the communities, because there are many own goals that have been scored, and which the ANC has also admitted to. There are many own goals, many opportunities have been squandered. The challenges that we are dealing now, I think is the time warning. The challenges that we are dealing now are well known, but there's no implementation. We are back to the government of national unity, and I just hope that it will not be. The feeling is that we don't need any more negotiations. People are talking about CODESA. We're talking about the basics. I mean, we're talking about the basics, filling the potholes. I feel ideological questions for us are a luxury because you are talking about the water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, fixing the potholes, the roads. Those are the basics. And if we can complicate issues and then begin to discuss bigger things without covering the basics, that can be that can waste a lot of time. And
It's
we don't have time.
Struggle credentials are no longer relevant when you talk about potholes. You know,
Yeah.
so I think you're right. So I think we have to appreciate the perspective of younger people who don't remember all those things that us older people, still think about are still important to us.
Yeah.
And I think one of the gifts of the ANC to South Africa was to accept the results.
That's one thing that's in a long time, I haven't found myself congratulating the ANC. I mean, that's one exceptional thing that one needs to appreciate. And it's very exemplary. But as we maybe move towards conclusion, it's a pity we really need to do another round with better time allocation. I just wanted to say that we have got
You're breaking up there for a second.
Oh, okay. I was just saying that we've got massive challenges in South Africa, no doubt about that. But I've realized that there are America of all places beginning to have some of the problems that you wouldn't, associate with America or the West in general, like challenge, refusal to acknowledge election results, delegitimization of the criminal justice system. It's pretty much the same thing that we've had with in South Africa. Those kind of leaders, personality cults, who, because of their own limitations, weaknesses, begin to trash everything else because I'm not complying with the laws, then I don't need the law because the Constitution. I have violated the Constitution. We no longer need the Constitution. How can you draw some of these parallels?
Yes. Well, South Africa and the U.S. have a very, very long history of relations. When I was talking about the education in the 1890s and all the South Africans that went to the U.S., the civil rights movement in the U.S., the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, they've long cross-fertilized each other and to the benefit of both. But we've also had the negative connection. So in the 1920s, when South Africa was trying to build industry to give good jobs to white people, who was one of the first industrialists that they invited was Henry Ford, set up an auto plant, 1923, with General Smuts. And Ford was a white supremacist that only hired white people in the US. So it was a good fit.
Unbelievable.
So we've long had our connections, and the current parallel is that we both countries have a former president with a whole lot of legal issues that they see political power being a solution to the personal legal issues. But we both have the same issue. So it's somehow the fate of our two countries has been connected for a very long time. But
that's
it's interesting. I've always been interested in learning more about this history of Americans in South Africa. It's pretty amazing. But it's Americans are generous and very volunteer oriented. There's always people volunteering, and there's still a huge reservoir of interest and support for South Africa and the US. And particularly with technology, it's something that we can tap into. And this is something that I've always thought would have been a good idea with all the expertise, useful expertise in the US, like with the critical thinking training and all of that. With modern technology, we could multiply those kinds of projects 1,000-fold.
Absolutely.
Pairing schools together, teachers, professionals, whatever. And not just the US, but other countries where there's technology and expertise. So just as a little thing, I've talked to young people and I said, well, if you have trouble with your math problem, what do you do? And the answer was, oh, we look up Khan Academy. It's a
They
website.
say what?
Khan Academy. It's a website started by an American to give like 5-minute, 10-minute lectures on a math problem, how to do. Very practical, very
That's
easy
brilliant.
to use. It's become very popular. So I met young people in South Africa that use that when they have a problem. So that's if we could somehow focus on those things. I've long lost interest in ideological debates and theorizing and all of that. And it's like you said, it's now it's about the potholes and the basics of service delivery, which it has been for the last 30 years. And for all those years, the ANC was getting a pass because you're the party that brought democracy. And even in this election, the DA didn't do any better than it ever has in the past.
Not at all.
And between the ANC, MK, and EFF, who were all basically from the same roots, it was the same majority that it's been. So voting, the ANC only got 40%. The voting patterns have not changed.
Actually, you are so right. Actually, that's my observation. The ANC has not been defeated. It is just splintering. They are splintering because if you put together the parts of the ANC still has the majority, which tells you that, one regrettable thing in South Africa is that the opposition has not been able to break through the wall of support that the ANC has. But otherwise,
and remember the problem with the DA, just to spend a moment on ideology and theory, the DA says in '94 South Africa became equal opportunity country. We don't need. We've gotten rid of all the apartheid laws. We don't need black empowerment. It's well, yes, because after 100 years of white empowerment, white people don't need anything. But
my summary of the problems that you are explaining is that the problem is that with the DA wants good governance without transformation, and the ANC wants transformation without good governance.
And if a government of national unity can improve the governance without backtracking on transformation, and in fact, you don't get transformation without good governance. It's just like in our small business project, which was sabotaged by corruption. I'm sure anyone that you can talk to can give you 50 examples of how service delivery was sabotaged. In this rural area where I'm working since 2006, there was a project to build a sports building, and from the provincial government. And so we said, well, we don't want a sports building. What we want is sports programs. So the MEC said, well, if you agree to let me build the sports building,